Chapter 41. Interlude, Slimere. You are listening at novelfull.audio. It was a beautiful Sunday morning in Darklight City, so the academy was naturally peaceful without hundreds of students walking around looking to cause trouble, which Stella greatly appreciated after the incident she faced with the students last time. Stella looked at Diana, and she had mixed emotions. They had spent the last few months just a meter apart in a private booth, which the head librarian had been so gracious to provide them because they were reading ancient texts that had to be safeguarded in a rune-engraved room that prevented decay. Diana had mostly read old fantasy books and spent the time relaxing her mind and meditating while Stella furiously studied the ancient runic language. On occasion, they exchanged words about life, and Stella found it hard to stay mad at Diana for what her family had done, especially with them now gone. But there was another odd emotion, nervousness. Stella hated to admit it, but she hadn't interacted with anyone in years. What if she said something weird? Maybe Diana already found her strange with how much she interacted with Ash. Stella shook her head to remove the useless thoughts and focused on their shopping trip. The two naturally had their wooden masks back on, so people gave them odd looks as they left the academy grounds and strolled down the cobbled street flanked by Chinese-style pavilions. Hey Stella, what books did you check out from the library? I thought you had written everything down. Diana quipped from the side as she released her hand from Stella's, and the two walked side by side at a relaxed pace. Books. Stella tilted her head. Oh. Those weren't books. I took out some technique manuals. Ah, technique manuals. I've never touched one before since I always had a tutor instead. Diana sidestepped a couple arguing in the street and continued, I heard they are challenging to understand. We could try and find you a tutor if you want. Nah. Stella chuckled, these books aren't for me. Stella paused as she felt embarrassed. I wanted to see if Ash could understand them. Although Stella couldn't see through the mask to see her reaction, Diana rolled her eyes and didn't comment anymore. The two walked through the streets a while longer, and the further they ventured into the city's heart, the wider the streets and the grander the pavilions became. This area of the city was primarily residential buildings with the occasional shop or restaurant here and there, but for high-end fashion, they would need to travel to the center. Stella suddenly felt a weight on her head and, reaching up, confirmed Maple had made an appearance. Hey little guy, how's Ash doing? The mythical squirrel chose not to comment and sprawled on her head, quickly falling asleep in the sun's rays. The blonde girl huffed and tried to ignore the stares of all the passing people. Although, to be fair, she did look rather odd, with her tattered clothes, black mask, and a white squirrel sleeping on her head. All the more reason for her to buy new clothes as soon as possible. I always forget how annoyingly big this city is sometimes, Diana commented as her soul core died down and the blue flames vanished. Been ages since I visited the central area. Stella appeared beside her, purple lightning arcing along her legs and the squirrel still happily sleeping on her head. You could say that again. Even with movement techniques, it took us 2 hours to get here. Wait, why are we at the airship station? Are we going to another city? Bells rang out as the sky darkened. An airship passed overhead and blocked out the sun. Suspended from its red balloon was a platform with hundreds of people wearing robes of various colors. They mingled around and looked over the railings at the city below. Stella watched as the balloon skillfully lowered into the courtyard of a massive building. Yes, we will go to Slimere. It's only one stop away. Their fashion industry is way better than here. Diana said as she walked toward the airship station entrance, come on. The airship that just landed should take us there. Stella followed closely behind, nerves festering in her stomach. She had never traveled via airship to another city before. The feeling only worsened as they walked through the grand entrance with hundreds of people, mostly mortals, walking around. Many people lined up at booths with workers in uniform handing out tickets, but Diana ignored all that and walked straight past. We don't have to buy a ticket. Stella wondered as they received annoyed stares from the people waiting in line. Diana scoffed, "Of course not. Cultivators travel free and without the need for a ticket. Just flash your cultivation to a ticket inspector if they ask. Is that a rule?" Stella felt that was a little unfair. "Yes, it is and always has been." Diana replied, "All the cultivator families manage their city's airship station. The whole operation is run by cultivators, so we naturally travel for free." Stella just shrugged. It was likely another way for cultivators to flaunt their power and avoid arguments. The money gained from charging the few cultivators compared to the millions of mortals wasn't worth the risk of a cultivator getting angry and destroying the station. Her eyes wandered along the vaulted ceiling and almost gawked at how dense the runic enchantments were. From buying just a courtyard worth of runic engraved stone, Stella knew the cost of the stuff, so to have such a massive building constructed out of runic-enhanced stone just showed the true wealth flowing through this place. Stella couldn't help but sigh that Diana. She would have been the heir of this entire city if not for the Winterrath and Evergreen families taking over. The two masked girls stood off to the side as a stream of mortals disembarked the airship that had just landed. Metal chains held the airship in place, and the metal platform hovered just a little off the cobbled ground of the courtyard. "Don't you feel angry?" Stella asked, her voice barely a whisper. Diana's white mask looked her way. "About what?" "All of this." Stella gestured around, "This should have been yours. How did the takeover of Darklight City even happen?" "I wasn't here." Diana sighed, angry. "No. I didn't want the position, and my family was a bunch of psychos, but I have to admit it's sad to be denied control over such a massive city. But it doesn't matter anyway." "What do you mean?" "Well, it's the same reason those families were allowed to invade without repercussions in the first place. It simply doesn't matter anymore." Diana crossed her arms under her chest as she leaned against the wall. "A beast tide is coming within the next few years. And according to the merchants, it's the largest one yet. Therefore, none of this will exist soon." Diana paused before adding, "The Blood Lotus sect has remained in this same spot for around 40 years, so there's not much more to mine or gain, so the families unanimously agreed to flee at the last summit and the Patriarch went into a final seclusion in preparation for the move. But do the other families not care? Don't they want House Ravenborn to survive?" "Survive?" Diana tilted her head in confusion. "Why would they want that? I bet the other families were cheering from the sideline as we were slaughtered. You see, once we move to a new location, there will be a fight over who gets what resources and land. So the fewer families to contend with, the better it is for the smaller families. But you should know all this already, since you are aiming for the Grand Elder position to claim some land in the new location, right?" Stella shook her head. "No, I didn't know any of this. I was ordered by a Grand Elder from the Disciplinary Committee to become a Grand Elder of the sect and pass the test since I was the sole heir to Redvine Peak, which I now know is bullshit. The Patriarch just wanted me to cultivate hard so he could use me as a pill furnace." Stella was interrupted by a man shouting, "Airship A3 to Slymere, leaving in 5 minutes. Forget that useless stuff that will only cloud your heart. Come on, let's go." Diana patted Stella on the shoulder before leading the way. The ticket inspector gave them an odd look when they didn't present their tickets, but when Stella flashed her purple chi, he waved them onto the airship's platform without another word. All the mortals piled on, but they gave Stella and Diana a corner of the platform to themselves. After a while, the metal chains keeping the airship tied to the building were unclipped, and a woman wearing a light gray robe stood on a platform in the center of the platform, right below the airship's balloon. Stella could tell the woman was in the first stage of the soul-fire realm. Light gray flames shot from her hands, and a gust of wind lifted the airship. "Wind element." Diana whispered over the roaring wind and shook her head in pity as she leaned over the railing, watching the courtyard get smaller as they rose. "This is the best job they can get with such a useless element." "Amicham." Stella agreed, and she also looked over the railing. They were sailing high in the sky over Darklight City within a few minutes. White clouds partially obscured the city, which spread out for hundreds of miles in all directions within the shadow of the mountain range. As they got higher, the wind rustled Stella's hair, which she put behind her ear as she searched the skyline for something. Her eyes lit up as she could see Red Vine Peak in the distance, but she was too far away to make out the pavilion or ash. To her, the Red Vine Peak was her entire world, but from so far away, it seemed so insignificant. Simply one of many mountain peaks that made up the colossal mountain range that had been heavily mined over the last few decades. Just another pointy lump of rock, like any other in this vast world. Except for Stella, it was special as the mountain peak had a dear friend that couldn't move living there. Diana leaned on the railing, her fringe flapping in the wind as the airship moved south of the mountain range. Say, Stella, what do you plan to do when the beast tide comes? Stay. Stella said hesitantly, there is no life for me anywhere else. I am sure Ash will have a way to keep me safe. Diana hummed, didn't say anything more, and simply watched the world go by, which Stella also indulged in. However, something about this airship ride helped put her life's significance into perspective. How many cities like this are there under the Blood Lotus sect? Stella couldn't help but ask as Darklight City became a black dot in the distance, and they passed over another mountain range. 9, but they are various sizes. Darklight is one of the largest, but its entire economy is based on spirit stone mining. Slymere, where we are going, is much smaller and depends on the Voidmind family's genius in creative industries and education. Stella just couldn't wrap her head around it all. Her father had mentioned the extent of the Blood Lotus sect in passing, but to hear there were 8 other cities under their control was hard to conceptualize. And how do all these people move to the new area when the beast tide comes? Diana took her mask off as they had left Darklight City and smirked, that's the worst part, they don't. These mortals breed like rabbits and live for too long, so the undesirables are left behind while those who can pay the exorbitant fee are allowed to escape. Stella tensed her grip on the railing, leaving loved ones behind didn't sit right with her. The pain of losing her family still ate away at her heart. But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. Traveling across the wilderness was dangerous and resource-heavy. Each airship needed a soul fire cultivator of the wind element to control, and each one could only carry so many people. Even if they had thousands of soul fire cultivators, all able to control an airship that could take hundreds of people, Stella couldn't see how 9 cities worth of mortals could all be moved. This world is brutal, and only the strong survive. A phrase Stella's father had said before leaving to cultivate, a decision he never returned alive from. Evidence that this world is not only brutal on the helpless mortals, but also on the cultivators. Both her family and Ravenborn had been wiped out in power struggles. Now arriving in Slymere. Stella was broken from her depressing thoughts as the light gray-robed women shouted about their arrival. Then, looking over the railings, Stella saw the clouds part as the airship began to descend, and she caught her first glimpse of Slymere. It was a city of black stone with spires that reached for the skies shrouded by a swirling cloud of smoke, but its most impressive feature was how it was built into the side of a mountain and was a multi-leveled city. As Stella's eyes wandered up from what appeared to be the industry sector at the mountain's base, she noticed the architecture got less crowded and more exquisite the closer to the mountain's peak she looked, with a grand building right at the top. Beautiful, isn't it? Diana commented from the side. A city that is the personification of the creative industry. The starving artists wallow away at the mountain's base, doing back-breaking work for little recognition, while those that make a name for themselves live high in the clouds. Diana then pointed to the palace of black stone that lord over it all at the mountain's peak, and we will be heading there, to the peak. That is where the artifacts are sold, and we can buy you the perfect clothes to impress your tree friend. What? It's not like that. Chapter 42. Interlude, Tainted Clouds Sect. You are listening at novelfull.audio. A plain-looking woman wearing far too much lavish jewelry that weighed down her ears peeked around the door and said flatly, "Ladies, the merchants are available to see you now." Her eyes shifted from a plain brown to the darkest of blacks as she dipped back behind the door. Stella sighed with relief. If she had to patiently drink another cup of tea while keeping a straight back and an uptight attitude, she feared she would go insane. Luckily Maple had left to explore the city. Otherwise, she would have died from shame with a fluffy white squirrel sleeping on her head. What made the whole experience even worse was how easily Diana handled the aristocratic terminologies and mannerisms. She looked within her element as she skillfully dealt with the servants and managed to set up a meeting with the merchant group staying over in Slymere for the day. Putting the cup of lukewarm tea on the ornate table, Stella stood up and joined Diana in following the woman to an adjacent room. Her eyes lingered briefly on the floor-to-ceiling crystal-clear windows that flooded the room with light. Clouds lazily went by, and Stella could even see the distant black dot within a vast valley that was Darklight City. Taking a deep breath in a vain attempt to calm her nerves, Stella followed and relaxed her mind as their shoes clinked on the smooth stone floor, and they passed many paintings depicting alien worlds. Some had glass buildings reaching for the skies, while others were barren wastelands with nothing but red mud and weird creatures prowling the land. Like everything else sold on this floor of the Slymere Consortium, they came from the rifts that appeared randomly in the wilderness. Stella had heard many legends about the merchants that dared to traverse the wilderness. They were said to be both strong but somewhat insane. Only the genuinely foolish or twisted minds would opt for a life spent on the run through the wilderness in hopes of stumbling across rifts. Stella's wandering mind was returned to reality as the void-mind woman opened the grand door with a resounding click and gestured them inside with a slightly off smile. Diana took the lead, and Stella followed. The moment Stella stepped through the doorway, an immense pressure pressed down on her shoulders, making each step a chore, as if she were walking underwater. The utterly white room was bare of any furnishings and was only occupied by 3 people wearing black cloaks and white skull masks standing in the center. It was impossible to tell their genders or ages until the one in the middle of the 3 spoke. "My name is Knox, and we are merchants hailing from the Tainted Clouds sect west of here." Her voice was feminine but had a gruffness that put Stella even further on edge. "Lady Voidmind informed us you wished to conduct a trade." Knox's hand emerged from the folds of her black cloak. It was covered in vicious scars and calluses, likely from intensive training. However, the most shocking part was the many silver rings decorating her fingers. If Stella remembered correctly, they were superior spatial rings that could hold 10 times more than the standard golden spatial ring. "Not a trade." Diana shook her head, "A purchase. Although I can throw the clothes I currently wear into the deal, they are heavily used and tattered, so I would feel prudish to offer them to your esteemed selves." Stella swore the pressure in the room increased a little, showing that at least one of them was a star core cultivator. Knox nodded, "I see you wear artifact gear, so that is acceptable. What price range and item are you looking for?" "Weapon artifacts are naturally the most expensive." "Just clothes," Diana replied, and Knox clicked her tongue. "You brought us here just to purchase clothes." One of Knox's silver rings flashed, and the white room became filled with artifacts that floated around as if suspended by an invisible force. "None of these tickle your fancy." "We obtain many items from the rifts where we risk our lives to explore. Out of all, clothes are the most common. It will not have been worth our time to meet you here today if you only purchase clothes." Diana crossed her arms, "Stop trying to force me into purchasing unnecessary things." Her gray eyes didn't wander as a captivating dagger floated past her nose. Instead, she was entirely focused on Knox's masked face. Knox stepped closer and loomed over Diana. She leaned down, her skull-masked face a mere inch from Diana's nose. "Quite the silver tongue you have." Knox's face then tilted to the left, ignoring Diana. Instead, she looked directly at Stella, causing the blonde girl to gulp. Knox's hand drifted over from the folds in her cloak, and Stella could smell the women's perfume, she was that close. Nox's hand slowly reached toward Stella's red maple earrings dangling from a black chain that Ash had gifted her all those years ago. I could forgive your insolence if you add these beauties to the trade. Nox whispered with a gentle voice with only a hint of gruffness, I can feel their otherworldly power. Stella reached up and grabbed the woman's arm, which made Nox pause. It was impossible to tell her expression due to the mask, but Stella could assume she was shocked. Don't touch them, Stella said flatly, an indescribable rage festering as she tightened her grip. She'd come here to get new clothes. If she ended up leaving without her earrings, she wouldn't be able to live with herself. They had been gifted to her at the darkest moment and allowed her to prevail into the woman she was today. Stella felt Nox push easily against her arm, and her fingers closed around the earrings, tugging on them slightly. Stella instantly activated the earring's power as she glared at Nox's masked face. To everyone else's surprise, Stella effortlessly slapped Nox's hand away, and the towering woman took a quivering step back. Stella deactivated the earrings as quickly as possible to avoid using the power on anyone else. It wasn't ideal for displaying their power, especially to someone interested in them, but if Nox had taken them, what could she do to get them back? With the aura of despair gone, Nox naturally calmed down and retracted her hand. Interesting. Stella felt ready to run if that was even possible, but a light cough from the side of the room made her look over her shoulder at the lady from the Voidmind family. Merchants of Tainted Cloud. Attempting to rob a junior while conducting business will be noted against your record. I hope you can complete today's transaction without any more incidents. She smiled, but her abyssal eyes weren't, making Nox take a few more steps back. Excuse me, Lady Voidmind. Nox bowed slightly. I let my curiosity about high-grade artifacts get the better of me. Then, breaking eye contact with Stella and returning her masked sights to Diana, Nox snapped her fingers, everything vanished, and the room became vacant. You want clothes? Let's get this deal done quickly and not waste any more of my team's precious time. A flash of silver shone through a gap in Nox's black cloak, and the empty white room was overfilled with display cases containing clothes. You have 10 minutes to pick out the artifacts you want. It will be 5 high-grade spirit stones or 10 dragon crowns per item. You will also be leaving your current artifacts here with me whether you choose anything or not. Diana didn't wait to hear Nox out and was already dashing between the display cases, never spending more than 3 seconds looking at each item. Then, deciding it was the only way to escape Nox and because she also wanted to take a look, Stella joined Diana in searching through the display cases. However, the more she looked, the less thrilled Stella became. The clothes were all similar to the ones Diana had worn before, and she didn't feel the style would suit her. That was until she ran into a section with clothes that appeared similar to the ones she was used to. Just a bit more revealing. But to be fair, she had always worn black cloaks or dresses that covered her entire body, whereas these clothes were the opposite. Other than a black headband with a golden crescent moon that she could use to manage her hair better, the rest of the outfit was a white kunoichi with black trimmings. A short skirt with flaps would expose her thighs, but a fishnet helped obscure the gaps, and almost waist-high white stockings would keep her legs warm. It was perfect. Stella felt it would suit her perfectly. Hey, Diana. The room was rather large, so Diana peeked her head over a stack of cases and shouted back, What? Can you buy something for me? Stella felt awkward admitting she was completely broke, but she had fed all the corpses she obtained to Ash, so she never had the opportunity to sell them. I can pay you back. No need. Diana ducked back down, and Stella lost sight of her. Pick whatever you want, and I'll buy it. I may be out of spirit stones, but I still have plenty of dragon crowns to spend. Stella had to remember that Diana had been the scion of one of the most wealthy families in the Blood Lotus sect. She may have been cut off from the family and lacked spirit stones to buy cultivator resources, but she still had plenty of mortal currency. Deciding not to waste Diana's generosity in her own time, Stella grabbed the clothes and dashed back to Knox. The women still terrified her, and she feared she may go after her earrings, but what was she supposed to do? Stella decided the only way out of this situation was to act arrogant and put on a confident facade. "Lady Knox, do you have any spatial affinity scrolls for sale?" Stella had taken some from the library, but they were basic ones that were freely available and not guarded. Basically trash. The clothes were a great find, but she felt this trip would have been a waste if she couldn't find a way to further her cultivation with techniques. Knox seemed to shiver hearing her name called by Stella, but she answered in her usual gruff tone. "Hammond here might have some. He is a spatial affinity user as well." One of Knox's teammates stepped forward, and a hand larger than Stella's face emerged from the black cloak with only a stack of silver rings on his pinky finger. The lowest one flashed, and a scroll appeared in the man's waiting hand. "This one lets you create short-range portals." His voice was higher pitched than Stella expected, considering this hand size, but she bared with it. The man then added, "It's perfect for assassinating people. Just open a portal next to their head, shove a dagger through, and bam. Dead. Killed plenty of old acquaintances that way." Stella thought of Ash's main way to attack. Since they had the same spatial affinity, she wanted a technique they could both use. Could his black roots go through a portal and drag someone back to be eaten? Stella wasn't confident of her favorite tree's full capabilities, but she felt the ability to open portals would also be helpful for her. "I'll take it," Stella replied, and the man dropped the scroll through a swirling purple portal, and a second one opened above Stella's waiting palm. "That will be 1,000 dragon crowns." The man chuckled and stepped back. Stella nervously laughed with the man. She really hoped Diana had enough money. Chapter 43. A Quiet Life. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ashlock liked to pretend he'd fully embraced his life as a cultivating tree in a crazy world of immortal humans that could fly around on swords, but that was a lie. It was impossible to ignore the signs that had begun to fester, no matter how well his new body's biology attempted to mask the impending crisis in his consciousness. A human mind simply wasn't designed to be sealed inside an immovable form. The desire for discovery, freedom, and connection are intrinsic parts of human nature, something the body of a tree, even with the potential of becoming a world tree, cannot provide. The system attempted to bridge the gap, providing Ashlock with potential tools to overcome the shortcomings of his new body, but they were makeshift solutions designed to obscure the fundamental problem. He was a fucking tree. But he had soldiered on, shrugging off the issue of his body through sleeping and while awake, being mentally stimulated by activity occurring around him. It was only in the stifling silence of the courtyard that Ashlock's mind had no choice but to wander and let the intrusive thoughts prevail. What if Stella and Diana never returned and nobody visited the courtyard ever again? Would he spend the next 1,000 years alone with the birds, surrounded by a decaying courtyard in disrepair? Watching the seasons endlessly go by with nothing but his thoughts to accompany him. Sure, he could summon things from alternate realms, but they were nothing but leashed monsters forced to carry out his every whim. They weren't companions nor friendly neighbors. They were nothing but slaves. It felt silly. He was a demonic tree, a consumer of the living to fuel his own rise to power. But for what? With nothing but his own thoughts, the question of, why does he truly want power, pinged around his vacant and numb mind. The obvious answer was safety and security. To be able to protect himself from the threats of this world. That was a good goal, but also a selfish one. Ashlock hated it. Hated to admit he wanted power for more than just himself. Was it so wrong to shelter those weaker under one's canopy? Or did he want to provide protection in the hopes they wouldn't feel a need to leave him again? Was the innate desire to protect from his human mind or tree body? Sometimes Ashlock couldn't tell the blurring line between the two. What did other people with high cultivation in this world do? Ashlock wasn't sure, but there was an obvious draw to starting a family, house, sect, or kingdom? Was it a genuine want to share knowledge and continue a bloodline? Or was it an ego thing, the desire to rule over others and have people wait on your every word? Ashlock watched the clouds go lazily by as his soul core hummed and chi harmoniously rose and fell between heaven and earth through his trunk. Unfortunately, he had only managed to upgrade a single stage in the soul fire realm over the last few months, likely due to his lack of consuming corpses lately. Since Larry was out busy causing havoc for the Blood Lotus sect, and with Stella and Diana off somewhere, Ashlock was very much alone and unable to acquire any corpses to feast on. Birds came by, and most died and contributed their lives to his growing forest of demonic trees surrounding the mountain. He killed the occasional one with his lilac chi, so he could still gain some points, but the going was slow. Everything was slow. Being a tree was slow, growing a forest was slow, and acquiring food was slow. Slow. Quiet. Alone. That summarized the last few months of his life as a tree, and it wasn't pleasant. He felt his human mind fading away, a part of him slowly dying. He needed a distraction, a purpose. A goal to work towards. With or without Stella and Diana, I need to survive and profit from the incoming beast tide. Ashlock still didn't know when it would arrive, how severe it would be, and if he could survive. But while Stella and Diana worked toward their Grand Elder exam and journey to immortality, he needed to prepare for the incoming threat. And work had already begun. While progress on his cultivation had mostly stalled, with no way to rapidly increase it nor access to techniques to utilize it. Significant progress in other areas had been made, mainly those using his system-granted abilities. Ashlock did wish to become more independent from the system. Although he didn't believe the rewards were genuinely random, having his strength directly tied to a gacha mechanic was less than ideal. He wanted power by himself, but he hadn't figured out how. Cultivation was a solution, but so was growing his sphere of influence. Feeling trapped in his own head, Ashlock summoned his sign.in system. Idle Tree Daily Sign.in System Day. 3465 Daily Credit. 261 Sacrifice Credit. 40, Sign In. Barley enough to secure a B grade draw. Ashlock had been holding off from signing in for almost 9 months. The temptation to feel the buzz of new knowledge or acquire another summons was tempting. He hated to admit it, but few things in this world provided him as much of a rush as utilizing his golden finger in this world, the Idle Tree Sign.in system. He knew it was a sham. A cleverly disguised way to motivate him to consume and forget his humanity. He didn't like killing, but he sure did enjoy the rewards that came after, which helped numb the guilt. His whole situation was like a cruel joke from a twisted god. Ashlock didn't even want to know who he offended in his previous life or what supposed atrocities he may have committed in a past cycle to be granted this fate. Calm down, Ashlock spoke aloud to nobody except himself. Sometimes hearing his own voice helped drown out the intrusive thoughts. Focusing on meditation and sleeping were also solutions. Unfortunately, it was the peak of summer, and the intense sunlight kept his mind abuzz, making shrugging off his problems difficult. Since he had been rather slothful lately, Ashlock decided to busy himself by doing a round of checks. As his body now covered such a vast area, keeping tabs on everything required a conscious effort. It's like my entire body is numb, and until I feel explicit pain or am alerted to something, I have no idea what is going on. Luckily, with how slow everything happened, Ashlock had little need to do checkups that often. His branches had grown alongside a few added meters in height. He now fully towered over the central courtyard, with his branches drooping in various fruit, spreading out and shadowing the other courtyards. 3 birds were feasting on his fruit, and to Ashlock's annoyance, 2 of them had sussed out the poisonous yellow ones. At least one will give birth to another demonic tree in an hour or so. There was something truly nefarious about knowing a life form had unknowingly sealed its fate. But overall, nothing of note was occurring on the surface. It was just another quiet day, the only thing of mild interest was his new glow. Dark mushrooms that sprouted between the cracks in the runic formation. The magic truffle that would help upgrade Stella's spirit root was also halfway grown. However, Ashlock hadn't played around with his new, magic mushroom production all that much. It was costly to make mushrooms even with such minor effects, and he wanted to focus on progressing his cultivation. Casting Eye of the Tree God, Ashlock's vision left his prison of a body and floated high in the sky. Darklight City loomed in the far distance like a black splotch on an otherwise scenic view. With his third stage in the Soul Fire realm, he could now see more of the city than ever. It had served for some decent entertainment, but a person could only listen in on mundane conversations and witness bar fights so many times before it got old. Ashlock had noticed that people in the world acted with humble attitudes. Conversations never diverged far from talking about the weather, how the rice fields were doing, and what neighbor had recently given birth. That last point had seemed odd, but the more he listened, the more Ashlock realized the true extent of the difference between this new world and Earth. Here, giving birth to 2 kids at once was considered normal, and triplets were ideal. The more he investigated, Ashlock soon discovered through idle conversation between excited mothers that giving birth was a lottery ticket. Each child had a low chance of being born with a spirit root, allowing them to cultivate or achieve the peak of the Chi realm before they died. So because food rich in Chi was so plentiful, childbirth was safe for mothers as they had resilient bodies, and children were strong enough to help around the house from a young age. Due to Chi, the mothers had no problems birthing an obscene number of children. In the hopes that one may be born with the talent to cultivate immortality and enroll in an academy within the Blood Lotus sect. Another point he had nitpicked from a particular conversation was the families of children attending an academy could buy evacuation tickets at a heavily reduced price, meaning nobody had to be left behind. Ashlock wasn't sure what being left behind entailed, but he could take a wild guess. Moving this many people would be impossible without some cultivator bullshittery, and if the exchange at the Ravenborn Spirit Stone Mine was anything to go by, a sharp reduction in earnings was a telltale sign of the beast tide incoming. His eyes wandered away from Darklight City and to the opposite peak. Nothing had changed except the palace of white stone growing in size and the discourse between the Evergreen and Winterwrath families escalating. They weren't perfectly balanced in strength, with the Evergreen family being the agreed upon stronger of the two, much to Winterwrath's annoyance. Ashlock wouldn't be surprised if a civil war broke out any day now. Larry, being an absolute menace to society, had also done an excellent job of furthering the divide between the two families by only targeting one family at a time and then switching. So all things considered, Ashlock wasn't really surprised nobody from either family had visited Red Vine Peak in the last few months. Which was good because they may find the sudden increase in demonic trees questionable. He hadn't cultivated a dense forest yet, but dotting the area around Red Vine Peak were the scarlet canopies of his children. Baby demonic trees. The tallest stood at a proud 8 meters, while the newer ones were nothing but saplings in full bloom. Summer helped speed up the growth process, so Ashlock hoped to get the entire area surrounded by them before winter rolled back around. Ashlock let out a sigh. Nothing had changed since he last checked a week ago, and he was bored. What about my roots? I haven't checked on them in a while. He sent a pulse of feeling through his roots. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until he felt pain. Pain. From my roots. That had never happened before. There was nothing to hurt Ashlock down in the mountain depths. It had been nothing but dull gray rock and the occasional small deposit of spirit stone ore for thousands of meters. So what could be nibbling at his roots? Chapter X1. Art. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Diana Ravenborn. https://i.imager.com/VUSGF55.jpg AI generation of Diana. https://i.imager.com/rfldi3.png Stella Crestfallen. https://i.imager.com/tvithia.jpg AI generation of Stella. https://i.imager.com/say6abp.png cover arts, in order, https://i.imager.com/eo8d94.png https://i.imager.com/x6njjx5.png https://i.imager.com/5iph8fy.jpg https://i.imager.com/3bwr7mr.png words. Chapter 44. Tree Combat. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As a spirit tree, Ashlock had always been able to see a few meters around his body, including his roots. However, his view range was significantly increased with the eye of the tree god, a skill in his escalating cultivation. Though one thing had always been a constant: his inability to see through things. Which unfortunately included rock, making the vision from his roots rather pointless and boring. Apart from the occasional deposit of silvery spirit stone ore, there was nothing but darkness and dull gray stone. But that had changed. Ashlock could feel a dull pain, a breeze, and the faintest sensation of warmth. His very deepest root was being gnawed on, thousands of meters down into the mountain, below ground level. He had encountered a monster of some kind. Now that he focused on it, the pain was quite intense. It felt like knives were being stabbed into his toe, which wasn't far from the truth. Ack. Holy shit, this is fucking painful. Ashlock internally grimaced as he came root to face with a monster. All he could see was the inside of its gullet and yellowing teeth chomping on his root as if it were a dog to a bone. Ignoring the pain and moving his view up a bit to where the root first broke into the tunnel, Ashlock could now see the creature. It was a gray-furred rat with beady eyes perched on its hind legs next to a minecart, and unless the rusted minecart was fun-sized, this rat was larger than a person. First Larry, and now this rat. Can't anything be normal-sized? With his root already partway inside the monster and the unbearable pain, Ashlock decided to kill it. He tried to cast Devour, but the skill wouldn't activate. So he tried again, but still nothing. Ha! Does my Devour skill not work far away from my trunk? The pain was getting intense the more he focused on it, so Ashlock decided to try burning it alive with his lilac chi. His soul core hummed thousands of meters above, and chi rocketed down the root. The silvery spirit stone ore glowed as the chi passed, giving it a boost, but with his soul fire cultivation, sending chi throughout his body had become far more efficient. Take that, you fucker. Ashlock felt like a god passing judgment upon a foolish bug. The rat seemed to sense something was coming a second too late. Lilac flames burst from the root, and the rat exploded in a fiery blaze of superheated guts. Ashlock wasn't sure why, but his spatial chi seemed very effective at causing things to explode. The blast echoed through the cramped mineshaft and made the walls tremble, blood and guts painted the walls, and the rusted minecart was blown off its wheels and lay tipped on its side off the makeshift rails. There were random bits of wood to make the rails somewhat even, and clear sections weren't connected properly. With the pain gone, Ashlock could finally think and take time to observe the new area. So this is what the inside of a spirit stone mine looks like. Ashlock assumed that was its original purpose. He hadn't seen any evidence thus far of cultivators mining for coal or iron, and Ashlock hadn't come across anything other than spirit stones during his descent through the mountain. Seeing a minecart in this world felt odd, but perhaps inventing a railway system was inevitable for any humanoid race wishing to transport many things over a predefined distance. Did other cities in this world have a metro system? Maybe trams? It was a funny thought, but the mortals of this world did need a way to get around, even with their increased strength and endurance due to chi. If a railway could exist down here, Ashlock found it hard to believe it never crossed the mind of anyone to put them in cities. So why wasn't a railway constructed on the staircase up to the Reborn peak to carry building materials? Ashlock had watched ordinary mortals lug stones up the mountain to construct the palace. Is iron expensive in this world? Or the cultivators just like to see the mortals struggle? Do the mortals have spatial rings? Ashlock hummed, or is it because of the beast tides? It would be rather silly to waste so much iron on infrastructure that will be left behind after a few decades. A weird scraping sound like nails on a chalkboard broke Ashlock from his wandering thoughts. Searching for the source of the sound, Ashlock saw a snout emerge from the tunnel's darkness. And then another and another. Finally, an entire horde of man-sized rats crept out of the dark and looked around with their beady eyes. They sniffed the stale air as if trying to locate the predator that had obliterated one of their brethren. Ashlock was naturally detached from the situation. Unlike human cultivators with their silly flesh prisons that could be torn apart limb from limb by a pack of famished man-sized rats, he was not in danger or had any real stakes in the events. He was a mountain-spanning tree, with his main body a Mount Everest amount of rock away. But he finally had direct access to a potential hunting ground with monsters that would hopefully provide more credits than birds. So what bothered him was how he could profit from this discovery. Blowing up rats with his chi in an abandoned mine was great and all, but if it didn't net him any sacrificial credits as his Devour skill had a limited range, it was all for naught and a pointless waste of chi. My roots are wide enough now for someone to crawl through, so I could transport pieces of the rats up to my trunk and then cast Devour for credits. The ability to transport things through his roots via a slow-moving sap was already part of his Deep Roots skill. His spiritual gaze lingered on the blood-stained walls of the mine, but I will need to limit the amount of chi I use as the corpse needs to be more than a paste on the wall. The rats approached the scene, and once they mutually confirmed there was no threat, they scampered over each other to lick the walls and slurp up any bits of organs they could find. Unfortunately, none of them paid much attention to the dangling root, a slight issue as his homebrewed chi attack, which involved setting himself on fire with his spatial chi, had a limited range of 0 meters. Ashlock made his root sway around slightly, the most movement he had ever exhibited since he was reborn. None of the rats cared. Maybe once they finish their meal, they will be interested. Time passed, and the rats left after cleaning every drop of blood from the walls. Not one of them even gave a passing glance at the root. Alright, back to the drawing board. My roots grow fast but far too slow to explore the cavern or chase down the rats. My devour has a limited range. What about root puppet? Assuming it doesn't have a limited range like devour, I could take over a rat corpse, draw the others into a fight and then blow it up to kill them all. The only issue is I need a corpse. If the pain hadn't been so excruciating, like being stabbed in the foot with a knife, Ashlock might have considered this plan earlier instead of vaporizing the rat instantly. It's okay. I just need to get a corpse somehow. Should I call Larry down here? Ashlock looked at how narrow the tunnels were and concluded Larry, with his wide body and titanic size, wouldn't fit down here even if he shrunk by half. So I need to come up with a solution myself. Ashlock skimmed his list of skills. Demonic Spirit Tree, Age 9, Soul Fire. 3rd Stage, Soul Core. Amethyst, Spatial, Summons. Ashen Prince. Larry, B, Skills, Eye of the Tree God, A, Deep Roots, A, Magic Mushroom Production, A, Language of the World, B, Lightning Chi Protection, B, Root Puppet, B, Chi Fruit Production, B, Transpiration of Heaven and Earth, C, Devour, C, Hibernate, C, Fire Chi Resistance, C, BL.net, Basic Poison Resistance, F. Ashlock groaned as he realized the only skill that could help him here. It just had to be fucking mushrooms, didn't it? So, in a world of mountain-splitting sword attacks and Tao manipulation, I will defeat this newfound foe with the power of magic mushrooms. How heroic. It was silly but perfect for the situation. Ashlock's mushrooms could grow anywhere his roots were, and the dangling root from the ceiling of a mineshaft was no different. Summoning the menu, he scrolled through the hundreds of options. I don't want to give the rats divine inspiration nor poison them. If anything, I want to make the tastiest and most fragrant mushroom of all time. Making a mushroom that released poisonous spores would be a waste of chi when he could make a cheap and tasty one and bait the rats to try and eat the mushroom from the harmless root. Ashlock hit the create button after also adding a slight glowing effect for maximum exposure. In real time, he watched white dots like warts appear all over the black root, and he also commanded his root to slowly continue into the tunnel and grow along the walls. These rats will be like a moth to a flame. Diana. Was this always here? Stella paused in her tracks. Red Vine Peak loomed ahead, dominating the skyline with its majesty. A poorly maintained dirt path overgrown with weeds winded through a lush forest of evergreen trees surrounding its base. The overwhelming amount of green made the scarlet-leaved tree at the forest entrance stand out like a sore thumb. Oh, by the immortal lords, it's multiplying. Diana deadpanned at the tree, which seemed almost identical to Ashlock. She then rubbed her temple and sighed, didn't we leave for half a year? What nonsense has that tree got up to now? Stella ignored Diana and rushed toward the tree with childlike curiosity. Ash, is that you? She called as she approached its trunk. The soil around the small tree had an acidic smell, red berries the size of one's thumb danged from its branches in clusters, and a half-dissolved maggot-infested corpse of a small rodent lay near its trunk. Scrunching up her nose, Stella placed a hand on the tree's bark and tried to feel for the presence of chi. Her eyes lit up when she felt the slightest tingle, but it was far below Ash's cultivation level. Diana came up beside Stella and also placed a hand on the trunk. Then, a moment later, she stepped back and shrugged, "Seems like an average demonic sapling to me. Not cultivated much yet, likely only consumed a few corpses." Stella also stepped away with a frown, the tingling sensation of chi leaving her fingertips. Just a random demonic tree, then. Perhaps. I honestly have no clue. Never seen a demonic tree grow around here as they are usually chopped down. Diana tapped her chin as she looked around. "We can just ask Ashlock about it when we get back." Stella nodded, and the two continued down the path, oblivious to the monster lurking overhead and watching their every move. Chapter 45. Ashlock's Betrayal. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Swarms of flies angrily buzzed around in the warm summer air, and the nauseating smell of decay and damp acidic soil tickled Stella's nose. She had walked this same path a few times throughout her life, and it had almost always been the same. Fresh air, a beautiful forest of vibrant green, and the chirp of birds. Somehow in just half a year, it had devolved into this, a graveyard masked by nature. Stella furrowed her brows as she walked past yet another demonic tree, this one taller and surrounded by more corpses than the last. And it was not alone, as there were 5 more up ahead. They were dotted around, nestled between clusters of evergreen trees. Stella could see signs of rot plaguing the evergreen trees surrounding the demonic ones. Their lush leaves were drooping and losing their color, some even withering away completely. A slow death. Approaching one evergreen tree stuck between 2 demonic tree saplings, Stella noticed the soil became a viscous mud that clung to her shoe. She feared getting her new white clothes dirty, so she stepped back. I hope Ash is benefiting from this somehow. Stella frowned and scrunched her nose in disgust from the putrid smell as she looked at the mud. I dislike how the gorgeous scenery around here has been ruined. It almost reminds me of the wilderness with all the death. Diana nodded. I agree. I have seen groves of demonic trees like this before. Eventually, the wildlife moves away or dies out, and the demonic trees decay from a lack of food. Stella kept walking through the dying forest with a sense of dread. Had Ash changed, or was this always part of his nature? With their barrier in communication, Stella could only derive so much meaning from his actions. But hopefully, that was set to change. With the ancient runic language crammed into her head, some of her questions may finally get answered. Shaking her head, lightning and purple chi flared to life. Come on, let's get moving. I have some burning questions that need answering. Diana nodded, and the two ran side by side, leaving a blazing trail of purple and blue chi in their wake. With some distance still to go, Stella decided to busy her mind with a conversation, anything to distract her from the dying forest and terrible stench. How are your heart demons? Diana's legs were a blur as she kept pace with Stella. Her dull eyes and flat stare always made Stella a little uncomfortable, but she had gotten used to it. My heart demons. From consuming beast cores. Diana returned to looking ahead as she continued, cultivation has become nigh impossible, but I feel the bottleneck loosening with every day that I resist the temptation of those accursed stones. Even from the side, Stella saw a slight pain in the young woman's gaze. But I will admit, I never thought going cold turkey from those beast cores would be so difficult. My sleep is plagued with nightmares, and my mind wanders and visits memories buried deep, forcing me to relive times I would rather forget. Diana gave Stella a thin and weak smile. I think this is the right step forward. I can't ignore my festering heart demons anymore. Stella gave a reassuring smile back. Well, that's good. Do you still plan to try and become a Grand Elder? The whistling wind and blurring scenery helped drown out the stifling silence as Diana mulled over the question. Grand Elder, huh? You know, the more I think about it, the more I despise the idea. A moment of silence passed before Diana added in her monotone voice. But I think we should both still do it. Ha! Stella was so flabbergasted she tripped and stopped running. Why in the 9 realms of hell would she want to become a grand elder and serve the patriarch, the man who wishes to create a pill in her stomach and use her life force and cultivation as fuel before discarding her dead corpse for the dogs? Well, if Ashlock has a way to keep us safe from the beast tide, are you fine with me staying behind with you and that gluttonous tree? Diana was looking at Stella, but the blonde girl kept looking ahead, refusing to answer. Thoughts rushed through Stella's mind. The idea was not bad, but did she trust Diana enough? Maybe. She eventually answered and offered an awkward smile. Diana looked away, her face emotionless and impossible to read. What is your plan for when the beast tide passes? Her tone was serious. Although this land is less valuable now, smaller demonic sects looking to relocate after the beast tide will come to seize this land. Stella didn't know that was a possibility, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. If the massive demonic sects like Blood Lotus were to relocate, they first needed to identify a place to move, one far enough out of the path of the incoming beast tide. Those smaller demonic sects didn't have a chance of competing with the large sects for the limited places that were both close enough to move to and far enough away to steer clear of the beast tide. What's your point? You will need people. Diana saw Stella's doubt written all over her face. If it's just you and Ashlock, alone on a mountain peak, how will you fight off hundreds of small-time demonic cultivators? Once you are in the Star Core realm, you will be stronger than almost all of them, but they can just wear you out slowly and strike at a moment when you are at your weakest. Stella nodded as the wind whipped her hair around. Everything Diana said made sense. What does this have to do with becoming a grand elder, though? Truth be told, Stella knew little about the sect and her surroundings. With nobody sticking around to teach her from a young age, she was left alone to figure things out. The Grand Elders get to select disciples from the mortals found to have a spiritual root and talent for cultivation. You could round some up and start your own demonic sect. Diana was cut off as the trees rustled, and something massive shot past overhead in a blur, even faster than them. The exit to the forest was just up ahead, but it darkened as something titanic blocked the way. Stella and Diana halted a few meters away from the looming threat in a cloud of dust, flashes of gold accompanied daggers materializing in both of their hands due to the environment. Swords would be a poor choice in a dense forest with low-hanging branches in the way. As the dust cleared and sunlight trickled through the canopy, the enemy became illuminated. It was an all-too-familiar spider. Its legs looked like spindly trees, and dinner plate-sized scarlet eyes stared them down. There was a sickening crunch as the behemoth bit down on the animal corpse dangling in its maw, and blood dripped from its fangs. Diana gulped, her dull eyes appraising the monster. Isn't this Ashlock's pet? Has it come to kill us? Every muscle in Stella's body tensed, including her heart. She felt fear, but worse of all, betrayal. With them gone, had Ash decided it was time to dispose of those that knew his darkest secret. The fact he wasn't a simple demonic tree, but rather the next world tree. Her knuckles turned white as the grip on her dagger tightened, the very same wooden handle she had been gifted as a child by Ash. The spider, a creature that had crawled through a rift from another realm to serve its master, stayed motionless, blocking the path while munching on its food. A silk sack, likely full of bodies, was secured on its back. Moments passed, and nothing happened. It's not attacking. Diana's stance didn't change, but her posture relaxed slightly. Does the tree not want to kill us? Instantly, the spider moved, it lowered to the ground as if ready to pounce. Oh no, blue flames shrouded Diana, and she dived to the side. Stella just stood rooted in place, glaring at the abomination. The spider flew up into the tree canopy in a whoosh of air and vanished from their sight. Branches and leaves tumbled to the ground in a cloud of splinters, and flies swarmed after the corpse's distant scent. Diana stumbled slightly but kept her eyes glued to the dense canopy overhead. Apart from the buzzing of flies and distant chirps of birds, there was the sound of wood creaking, but the noise was moving further and further away. The spider was leaving. Stella wiped her sweat-soaked hair from her face with a shaking hand. Her breath was chaotic, and her knees felt weak. Not only had the monster been terrifying, but it was the implications. Had the spider attacked and slaughtered them in cold blood, was it Ash's fault, or was the spider acting autonomously and simply deemed them a threat or a tasty snack? The demonic trees surrounded by skeletons and half-eaten corpses and the appearance of Ash's pet executioner all pointed to worrying signs. Had Ash finally decided, or become able, to take an active role in this world? Would he even need her now? Stella's finger twitched, a terrifying thought crossing her mind. Could she even win if she needed to fight to take back Red Vine Peak from Ash? Ash was a tree, one that had displayed some capabilities in combat with the black vines. But his true strength lay in his spirit beasts. Like most powerful spirit trees out in the wilderness, Ash utilized the strength of contracted beasts to do its bidding and protect him. There was an urge to leave, turn tail and run, just on the off chance her wild theories turned out to be true. Stella didn't want to confront Ash and discover the tree had turned against her. Surely their bond was deeper than that. Right. She let out a deep, long breath while closing her eyes. Her nerves washed away, and a grim determination rose up. You okay? Stella felt a hand on her shoulder, and looking back, she saw Diana's dull eyes showing a hint of concern. I'm fine. Stella hated how shaky her voice was. Just give me a second to collect my thoughts. A while passed, and the spider didn't return. Nothing was obscuring their path to the mountain's peak, which had transitioned from a warm home to daunting and hostile in Stella's mind. Ashlock was having a fantastic week. Ever since discovering the abandoned Spirit Stone mine, his mind had been racing with ideas that distracted him from the stifling loneliness. It had given him a focus, like a minigame. For the birds, he had already ironed out a system that had been working so far and required little input. He produced a set group of fruits of various colors and randomly assigned them the poison and demonic tree seeds. Unlike an ordinary tree, which wouldn't have the intelligence or capabilities to randomly switch which fruit contained the poison, he did. It worked like a charm but was so damn dull. Watching birds die was only fun the first 100 times. Whereas the mineshaft was an active war zone. Rat versus tree. The mushrooms had worked like a charm, and the stupid rats fell for it every time. Sure, there wasn't action all the time, just like now. But by paying half attention, whenever he felt something step on the roots coating the mineshaft floor, he would send a surge of chi down his root and turn the tunnel into a furnace of lilac flames. The lovely cooked bits of rat would then be brought up his roots via the sap conveyor belt. However, something had been bothering him. Where was the darn entrance to this place? He inspected every nook and cranny of the mountain with his eye of the tree god skill. After searching the entire mountain 5 times, Ashlock was ready to conclude it had been cleverly sealed up, likely to prevent the rats from escaping and terrorizing the villagers nearby. But as Ashlock looked past the forest surrounding the mountain, he saw 2 figures crest the ridge. Their clothes had changed since he last saw them, but he could recognize that blonde hair and cheery smile anywhere. Once again, the passing of time felt surreal. Ashlock didn't want to admit it, but the relief they had returned made him want to cry. Luckily, he was a tree and lacked the facilities to create such a scene. With excitement, he pulled on his mental tether with his pet spider. Oi Larry, get back here. The girls are back. I need those bodies to communicate. Ashlock then listened in on the conversation between the two. The idea of them becoming Grand Elder and starting a sect around him made his mind wander with endless possibilities. If a sect was built around him after the beast tied, he wouldn't ever have to be alone again. Also, he would have a group of minions to order around to gather corpses for him to feast on. It was almost too perfect of a plan. Chapter 46. A tricky conversation. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ashlock had never thought about it, but in a twisted way, cultivators were more degenerate than video game addicts back on Earth, no matter how he looked at it. If you removed the context and danger of the world, cultivators were junkies that refused to eat or sleep in favor of chasing the high of immortality. The trashed, overgrown, and in disrepair pavilion was a perfect example. Without hundreds of housekeepers tending to a cultivator's needs, they allowed their surroundings to mirror their non-existent attentiveness to self-care. It was easy to look at Stella or Diana and see a human. They walked and talked like one, but that is where the similarities ended, and the mysteries of their biology began. It was so alien due to the presence of Chi that they would baffle scientists worldwide back on Earth. They could survive weeks without food or water. Their delicate skin wouldn't blemish even if a bowling ball smacked them in the face, and they could effortlessly travel at speeds that would cause a regular human to pass out from the sheer G-force. Stella and Diana shot up the mountain as balls of fire with enough speed to cause sonic booms that echoed throughout the peaks, causing birds to flee by the dozen. Literal fire twisted by a physical manifestation of their soul gushed out their skin and empowered them beyond what should be possible. They were the peak of human evolution. Superhumans, on the edge of demigod status. The pair sheepishly entered the courtyard hesitantly for an unknown reason. They took every step carefully while scrutinizing their surroundings. Stella's eyes, in particular, scanned between his branches, and she tensed up when Larry's scarlet eyes peered through the dense canopy. "Larry, back off." Ashlock ordered his pet spider. "They are scared of you, but leave the corpses carefully on the ground. I need them in peak condition." Ashlock didn't know why, but the girls had also freaked out when they saw Larry back in the forest. Stella had made her displeasure for Larry clear from the beginning, but to be terrified of him seemed unusual for cultivators of their caliber. The behemoth spider slowly crawled back, hiding from view, and the sack of corpses was carefully lowered to the ground by a silk thread. Ashlock had a lot of things to say, but he was unsure how to go about it. However, before Ashlock could even cast Root Puppet on the corpses, Stella stood defiantly before him. It took a moment, but she eventually gathered the courage to ask him a question. "Ash, are we friends? They know my name." Ashlock was thrilled. Somehow they had translated his previous message, "But why is she calling me Ash?" Was there a mistranslation? Ashlock naturally flashed his lilac chi a single time to indicate yes. All the unusual tension in the air dissipated, and Stella relaxed, a smile blooming on her face. "Phew. I was worried over nothing. With all the demonic trees sprouting up and Larry coming to meet us, I thought you had gone against us." Ashlock was baffled. What kind of leap of logic had occurred inside Stella's mind to come to that conclusion? All he was doing was spreading out his demonic trees to hopefully link up with them soon through his roots now that they had reached the mountain's base. In fact, he would have done that already if the mineshaft and rats hadn't distracted him. "Anyway, I assume that's a sack of corpses, just like last time. Let's find a nice wall for you to write on." She looked around at the overgrown and half-destroyed courtyard. All of the white walls were obscured with vegetation and mold. Mushrooms sprouted through the cracks, and despite the midday sun, Stella squinted her eyes as she approached them. "Are these glowing mushrooms?" "Seems so." Diana shrugged, never seen mushrooms grow this high up before. "Okay, whatever, this all needs to go. Diana, can you clean this wall?" "Unfortunately, my spatial chi and lightning Dao don't assist much here." Diana rolled her eyes, "Sure. But this is a perfect example of why we need more people." Blue flames erupted from Diana's open palms and bathed the wall in its wrath. But to Ashlock's surprise, the fire morphed into something else entirely, a superheated mist. Meanwhile, Stella walked up to the bundle of silk and slashed it with her dagger. She reeled back in anticipation of the rancid smell of rotten corpses, but to her surprise, these are fresh. Ashlock hadn't been keeping tabs on his pet spider all that much, but he had to agree the corpses weren't even slightly decayed and, therefore, likely fresh. Had he nabbed them from a village on the way or something? Stella grabbed the one on the top, a woman with plain features. It was obvious how the woman died. Her mouth was filled to the brim with ash, and there was a sizable hole through her stomach as if one of Larry's legs had impaled her. "Hey Ash, is this corpse good?" Ashlock didn't know how he felt about Stella calling him Ash. If anything, he preferred the name Tree. It felt more endearing to him due to its history. They grow up so fast. It felt like only yesterday that Stella hugged me happily, saying Tree over and over again until I dropped fruit on her head to shut her up. "Ash, are you listening to me?" "Oh shit." Ashlock flashed his chi once more to indicate yes. Why is communication so tiresome? Ashlock sighed as he watched Stella drag the corpse to the newly cleaned wall. Diana stepped back and admired her handiwork as the steam dissipated in the violent mountain winds. The mushrooms Ashlock had cultivated to lighten up the place were gone, and so were the overgrown weeds that had sprouted from the cracks. A shame, but he preferred the now clean wall, it would be his canvas for communication. As Stella stared blankly at the wall with her jaw moving as if on the edge of forming words but not quite there, Ashlock cast Root Puppet on the female corpse. The process still creeped him out, especially since he could feel every millimeter of the woman's flesh from the inside out. The body shuddered as it shakily stood up with the support of the wall. Ashlock noted the puppet's lack of a soul core. TSK, late stage of the Chi realm, this corpse won't last long. He made the corpse frantically gesture to the wall. "Okay, a simple question first," Stella said as she crossed her arms and eyed the corpse. Ashlock waited, and Stella took a deep breath. "What are you?" The corpse stood utterly motionless. How is that a simple question? Ashlock wanted to shout. To be fair, for most things in the universe, that was a simple question. But he was a tree with a unique backstory that made answering such a question tricky. What was he supposed to say? They seemed to think he would become the future world tree, but nothing in his status explicitly said he was anything but a demonic spirit tree, with a magic system from God knows where. But even calling himself a demonic tree was a stretch. Ashlock had observed the ones he had fathered, and they all naturally turned the soil acidic and bore poisonous berries. Two things he had never done in his 9 years as a tree. So if he wasn't a world tree, nor a typical demonic tree, what was he? Human. The thought of still identifying as a human felt wrong. He no longer had human desires such as accumulating wealth or chasing after jade beauties. And it was not only a mindset shift but a biological one too. Ashlock didn't feel even an ounce of lust for anything, only a love for nature and a desire to protect those he cared about. While an immense hunger to devour corpses festered in the back of his mind, he also enjoyed poisoning birds to spread his seed. He may operate on human logic, but his emotions all dulled. People could be gutted before him, and he wouldn't feel a thing. Only a few emotions still had much effect, such as crippling loneliness. Ashlock made his decision, and the corpse approached the wall. Biting off the end of her finger, the corpse got to work writing out a message in squiggly lines before bursting into lilac flames. Stella kicked the flaming corpse to the side and scrutinized the words with her hands on her hips. The language Ashlock wrote wasn't English. He thought in English and intended to write in English, but the result was apparently some ancient runic language that looked very different from the letters he remembered from Earth. Must be my language of the world skill interfering. If it upgrades to a grade, would it give me access to more written languages? Stella sat on the floor. Her golden ring flashed, and papers covered in scribbles encircled her. What does it say? Diana stood behind Stella and asked over her shoulder while looking at the paper in her hand. I don't know. What was the point of you spending so many months learning it if you can't understand? no, Diana. Stella cut her off and pointed at the wall. It literally translates to I don't know. Diana tilted her head in confusion. Ashlock doesn't know what he is. Stella nodded. Diana turned around and appraised the tree. Would a world tree know it's a world tree? I don't know, and clearly, neither does Ash. Stella huffed to herself and massaged her temples. A while passed before she apparently decided on the next question. Ash, what is your goal? Ashlock was starting to wish he'd never attempted communication. Conversations with mouths were easy, the words just rolled right off the tongue, but this reminded Ashlock of when he tried texting his crush in university. He had to carefully think about every word. He felt as if he was staring at a blank text box with a flashing cursor, taunting him for his hesitation. What was his goal? Another tricky question, but at least he had some viable answers to pick from. He had many plans. Devour the strong, obtain more sacrificial credits, upgrade and unlock more skills, acquire new summons, and have Larry evolve to A and then S rank. Transcend this world, become the next world tree, and lord over all creation. And never be alone again. Was there a single sentence? A compact phrase to describe his insatiable greed for power and desire to grow while consuming all possible resources. All while being surrounded by people to help him along the way. Ashlock looked at the two women, the desolate pavilion fit to house thousands, the empty training courtyard, and the beautiful surroundings. This would be his home for a long time to come. The last thing he wanted was for some demonic cultivators to come by, trash his little pocket of paradise, and enslave or chop him down. The answer had never been so simple. A corpse rose, a burly man with likely a bright future torn away to serve a cruel fate as nothing more than a simple messenger. With the soul core, he likely cultivated carefully over his short life cracking, the corpse stood before a blank section of wall, and he wrote a decree with his still warm blood dripping from his torn finger. Stella and Diana watched in anticipation as the corpse spelled out a single sentence that would change the course of Red Vine Peak's history. With the final swish of its finger, the corpse stood back and marveled at its handiwork before the wrathful flames of its ungrateful master reduced him to ash. A fitting end considering the message. To found a sect named Ashfallen. Chapter 47. Ashfallen. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ashlock didn't pride himself on being the most imaginative tree out there when naming things, but he felt Ashfallen was fitting. A few potential sect names had drifted through his mind, such as Haunted Willow or Blackroot. But the name Ashfallen had actual meaning behind it besides being tree-themed. Firstly, it was a fusion between Ashlock and Stella's surname Crestfallen. Secondly, Larry utilized the Tao of Ash. Also, Yggdrasil, a world tree from Norse mythology back on Earth, had been an ash tree. Ashlock waited in anticipation as Stella spent a good while translating his text. Unfortunately, it appeared the name was giving her some problems, likely because it didn't have a direct translation. In the future, he will make sure to use simple words to avoid confusion. To his relief, Stella translated his message exactly after around an hour. I did it. I finally translated it. Stella jumped up, sending her notes flying. To found a sect named Ashfallen. That is what it says. Diana whispered, and Stella instantly calmed down. She looked happy but also worried. Had he made a big mistake? Was founding a sect really such a big deal? To Ashlock, the Blood Lotus sect was nothing more than a few families surrounding Darklight City on mountain peaks. Sure, the city was huge, and he had seen the power exhibited by the grand elders of the various families, but it wasn't like he needed Stella and Diana to publicly renounce their allegiance to the Blood Lotus sect to join his. Also, from his understanding, all of this will be abandoned when the beast tide comes. So what's the problem with him getting ahead of the game and forming his sect early? Ashlock reflected on the novels he had read that were based on similar worlds he found himself in. Oh. Is this a world where they take swearing allegiance super seriously? Like a master-disciple relationship. It was a possibility. Cultivators loved to be arrogant, but they also valued their pride and traditions. Often to join a sect, a fledgling disciple would have to undergo trials, and once passed, they would be sworn into the sect either as an outer court disciple or, if they were lucky, picked by an elder to train directly under them. Once again, Ashlock was reminded of how clueless he truly was about this world despite spending almost a decade in it. But now he had the opportunity to ask and learn. Knowledge is power, and he needed all the strength he could get. Ash, do you want Diana to be part of your sect? Ashlock saw Stella standing below his trunk, and Diana was standing back near the wall. Was there some discourse between the two he was unaware of, other than the whole family drama from before? The honest answer to Stella's question was yes. It was hard to come by people, and having a sect of only two sounded counterproductive. Also, the more, the merrier. And if Diana acts up, I can get Larry to deal with her. Ashlock was confident that Larry was stronger than Diana by now. If only he would hurry up and upgrade. With that in mind, Ashlock flashed his chi to signal yes. L.RG Stella clapped her hands. If Ash trusts you, then so do I. Do you want to join? Diana had a thin smile. I was the one who suggested the idea of a sect in the first place. So, of course, I will join. She then turned to Ashlock. However, joining a sect run by a tree comes with a big risk. We cannot run. When the beast tides come, we have no choice but to stay behind. So Ashlock, do you have a way to keep future sect members and us safe? A thin black root took control of another corpse. It walked to the wall and wrote an answer. Which was quick and easy for Stella to decipher after kicking the flaming corpse to the side. Ashlock says he needs more information about the beast tides. Ashlock was actually surprised Stella managed to translate his words. Were beast tides present when the ancient runic language was still in use? Diana decided to take on the burden of answering. She awkwardly walked up to Ashlock as if he would struggle to hear her and didn't know exactly where to look. To be fair, it was like talking to a wall. Ashlock had no eyes or mouth for the other person to focus on, just a black trunk that was a few meters wide. Awkwardly clearing her throat, Diana began her explanation. The beast tide is simply a byproduct of the world's ley lines. Diana pointed to the ground. Running under this sect is a pathway for the world's chi. It is why the spirit stones form here deep underground. Ashlock had heard of ley lines before in fiction. They were basically the veins of the planet and where the chi was concentrated. Cultivators often fought to build their sects along or on top of these ley lines, where the most chi was released for cultivation. Could I get my roots to go down and latch onto the ley line directly? Ashlock's non-existent eyes practically lit up. The small deposits of spirit stones had given him a good boost in his cultivation, so what would plugging himself directly into the world's chi supply do? Could he even handle it? Anyway, the ley lines sometimes converge and pass over one another. These areas are highly sought after for the beasts that wish to endlessly cultivate and evolve. In fact, the chi is said to be so strong in the area it forms a spiritual spring of chi. So these beasts like to converge as a group around these spiritual springs, which appear where the ley lines cross. But that doesn't explain why there are beast tides. However, if too many beasts go to one spiritual spring, it depletes and then takes between 40 and 100 years to replenish. Diana pointed into the distance. Let's say there's a spiritual spring in the far north. Millions of beasts went there, fought each other, and became stronger. The weaker beasts then have no choice but to leave, so they all race to the next spiritual spring as it replenishes, which might be south of here. Still doesn't explain why they all come as a massive horde in a wave. Wouldn't the monsters leave in smaller groups? The distance between the spiritual springs is usually massive, and the spirit beasts cultivate and survive off chi, so they prefer to run along ley lines. Diana gestured to Darklight City. the only problem with that is us cultivators decided to build along these ley lines, so the beasts with some level of intelligence choose to travel all at once instead of being picked off one by one. Okay, now it was starting to make sense. To recap, the beast tide is a collection of intelligent beasts wanting to move from one good cultivating location to another. And they had the intelligence to realize their strength in numbers when crossing the cultivator-infested wilderness. To the beasts, they had to fight not only each other but also random groups of cultivators, so traveling the wilderness would be even more dangerous for a beast than a merchant group. The good news is these beast tides are easy to see years in advance and almost always follow predefined paths. They can be fought off, which is something the Celestial Empire does, but for smaller demonic sects like the Blood Lotus sect, moving out of the way makes financial sense. Ashlock now saw the problem. Unlike every other demonic sect out here in the wilderness, he couldn't move. Nor did he have the strength to resist a beast tide that only a superpower like the Celestial Empire could face. As he saw it, there were three options from this information. First, the Ashfallen sect got strong enough to face off any beast tide. This was the ideal endgame, but with their meager soul fire realm strength, he doubted they could face the wave of monsters. Second, everyone runs away and returns once the beast tide has passed. From how Diana described it, he didn't think the beasts would stop to spend time destroying Red Vine Peak and eliminating his trunk and roots just to kill a random tree. I must ensure I have no fruit growing to attract their attention when they pass by. The final option lay in the tunnels under the mountain. Ashlock wasn't sure why everyone didn't just hide underground. Luckily, he could now have his questions answered. He took control of a corpse once more and wrote his question on the wall. Why don't people hide underground? Stella helpfully translated, and Diana rubbed her chin. That is a tricky question to answer. The simple answer is they do, and a lot survive the beast tide passing. It's what comes after that usually kills them. All the fields will be ruined, and no cultivators will stay behind to protect the survivors from the stray beasts not heading to the spiritual spring. Diana looked up at Ashlock's scarlet leaves. With nobody to protect them, the helpless mortals die to starvation or beasts. If they are lucky, they might be enslaved by the other demonic cultivators who choose this land as their new sect location. So hiding underground was an option. It came with logistic issues, such as creating a space ample enough for people, keeping it safe from the beasts, and providing food. But possible. He could produce edible fruit and mushrooms with his skills, although obtaining water was still an issue. But those rats had to be getting water from somewhere. If there is a large cave with a stream running through it, we could use that for water after eliminating all the rats. Wait, are the rats edible? Ashlock used one of the last corpses in the bag to write his plan and then had the corpse frantically go over to one of his exposed roots and start shoveling at the soil with its hands. Stella quickly translated the message. Ashlock says for us to go underground. Underground. Diana raised a brow. How? We are thousands of meters above ground. Her gaze landed on the corpse, frantically digging while its skin melted from lilac flames. Does Ashlock expect us to dig through the mountain? Diana kicked the corpse away, and it exploded in mid-air, sending a wave of chi that was resisted by both of them, blocking with their own soul flames. With the corpse out of the way, Ashlock watched as Diana looked down into his hollowed-out root. He had drained this root sap as it led all the way down through the mountain to the mineshaft below. Obviously, he still had a few roots filled with sap bringing up bits of rat that he had then been consuming with Devour over the last week. But in anticipation of wanting to get Stella's help, he had widened and drained this particular route. It was like an 8,000 meters long slide through the mountain. Are we supposed to go down there? Stella asked with a hint of nerves. Ashlock had to admit it didn't exactly look inviting. It was a sticky tunnel, barely a person wide, that was pitch black, leading somewhere unknown. But there was no other choice. He hadn't found the entrance to the mine. Diana could carve through an avalanche with ease, so I'm sure she could blast a tunnel through the side of the mountain, but then how do we plug the hole back up? Ashlock felt a bit bad for asking them to get to the mineshaft this way. Maybe now would be the best time to sign in on the off chance it gave him something useful. He had been holding off for ages. Idle Tree Daily signed .in System Day. 3472 Daily Credit. 268 Sacrifice Credit. 103, Sign in. Yes. Sign in successful, 371 credits consumed, unlocked AB. Grade Evolution. Demonic Eye, Evolution. Ashlock couldn't believe there was a new option. So he could evolve as well. Could typical spirit trees evolve? And what the hell was a demonic eye? Ashlock soon got his answer. He felt terrible pain, as if someone was pulling him apart from within. His chi became chaotic, and his trunk groaned as the bark splintered. Evolution in progress. 10%, Ashlock is doing something weird again. Diana shouted as she leapt back. Chapter 48. Affectionate Gaze. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Diana jumped backward, but Stella decided to approach Ashlock with trepidation. Ash, are you okay? Hey. She could tell something was terribly wrong. The chi in the surrounding air trembled. A chaotic vortex formed that rustled Ash's scarlet leaves as if he were the eye of a great storm. Birds for miles took to the skies and cried to the heavens. Stella winced. She knew whatever was happening would cause unwanted attention from the nearby cultivators. She looked to the sky, but there was no crack in space with another terrifying monster crawling out from another plane of existence. So what was wrong? There was a deep groan of wood warping as splinters flew, and a hairline crack appeared on the black trunk. Was something trying to escape from within Ash? Her heart raced as the tree trunk suddenly split open like an accused maw, revealing a grotesque and eldritch eye that gazed upon her with alien intelligence and curiosity. Stella felt a chill run down her spine as she gazed into the depths of the eye and beheld a vision beyond human comprehension. Multitudes of eyes, both large and small, were engaged in a cyclical feast of consumption, one devouring the other in a nauseating display. The eyes were superimposed upon one another in a labyrinthine pattern that defied the limits of mortal understanding. The eye seemed to peer into the very essence of Stella's being as if daring her to look away. But she couldn't move, for she was frozen in terror and awe by the unspeakable horrors that lay within. The eyes seemed to grow and multiply, their pulsing movements drawing her deeper into a maelstrom of fear and madness. Stella screamed as she threw up, her voice echoing through the courtyard and mountain as she stumbled away from the accursed tree. The eldritch eye followed her every move, its malevolent gaze burning into her soul. She knew that she was in the presence of an entity beyond the grasp of mortals, and that she had gazed upon a truth that was never meant to be seen by human eyes. As she stumbled back, Stella felt the eldritch eye's grotesque and malevolent presence still upon her. Her body felt deathly weak. Her legs felt like grass stalks in the wind, swaying without her consent. Mutation complete, the pain vanished, and Ashlock blinked. The slit in his trunk slowly closed. It felt effortless as if it had always been a part of him. Stella fell onto her back, her breath shallow, and she kept her eyes on the sky, refusing to look at him. What happened? Was seeing a tree with a giant eyeball hidden within truly so terrifying? There had to be weirder things in this vast world. Right. Demonic Spirit Tree, Age 9, Soul Fire. 3rd Stage, Soul Core. Amethyst, Spatial, Mutation, Demonic Eye, B, Summons. Ashen Prince. Larry, B, Skills. His stat menu popped up unpromoted, which distracted Ashlock briefly. Oh. A new section. Ashlock focused on his new mutation, and the information for its uses entered his mind, making Stella's adverse reaction even more bizarre. I can gaze upon people's souls. Ashlock opened the eyelid and looked at Stella with his demonic eye. She shuddered despite not looking in his direction and keeping her eyes on the sky. Ashlock's usual spirit sight let him see everything in his range all at once, but this demonic gaze was very narrow and directed. Everything was tinted through a red hue, and he could see the flow of chi. But perhaps most bizarre of all was what he could see within Stella. There was a marble around the size of a fist filled with a dark purple storm with lightning flashing occasionally. Is this Stella's soul core? His demonic gaze shifted to Diana, who was busy leaning against the far wall trying to control her breathing. Her face was deathly pale, and her eyes were wide open and unblinking. Had she seen something so horrific? Floating inside her chest was a marble filled with nothing but dark blue water that swirled around in a vortex. Seeing that Stella and Diana were struggling under his gaze, he closed his eyelid and returned to his spiritual sight. Both girls perked up a little as if a great weight had been lifted from their shoulders. What in the 9 realms of hell was that? Stella blurted to the sky between deep breaths. Her chest rose and fell as she gasped for air. Diana stumbled from the wall and began to chuckle, which soon devolved into full-on-belly aching laughter. She was practically crying tears as she trudged forward. Stella was in such a state she didn't even comment on Diana's weird behavior. Ha ha ha. I was a little worried that nobody would take Ashlock seriously. She straightened her back and wiped the cold sweat from her forehead, but if every new sect member saw whatever that was, nobody would question why a tree is a patriarch. She then let out a deep breath to calm her shaking breathing. Just whatever you do, don't show us that eye again, okay? Ashlock didn't see what the big deal was. To him, it just looked like a giant eye. Its color and details were constantly shifting, but it wasn't that horrifying to look at. If he could shrug, he would. He honestly didn't see the big deal, but if their reactions were anything to go by, a giant eyeball was enough to scare a soul fire cultivator to his extent. The girls were clearly adverse to him using his new mutation, but he still planned to utilize it in the future. The demonic eye lets me see a cultivator's element without them revealing their flames. I can also see if they have Tao comprehension, such as Stella's lightning. There had also been another important detail. The darkness of their flames was similar. I remember Diana mentioning she was in the 6th stage with a plain blue soul core and inferior spirit roots. So they should both have inferior spirit roots. Ashlock then thought about his own lilac flames. Stella and I share the same spatial element, but my soul flames are lilac rather than dark purple. Does that mean I have superior spiritual roots? On his status sheet, it only said Soul Fire. 3rd stage, Soul Core. Amethyst, spatial, there was no mention of his spirit roots purity. If that impossibly perfect wooden stick I summoned was anything to go by, I wouldn't be surprised if I have perfect spirit roots. The system has to show off its superiority somehow. Ashlock rolled his eye, but he wasn't about to complain about the system giving him perfect spirit roots. Stella wiped the vomit from her mouth and chugged some water from a water skin she retrieved out of her spatial ring. She was still shaking slightly, but she was able to stand up. After spitting to the side to remove the rancid taste plaguing her mouth, she glared at the trunk with mixed feelings. It looked the same as always, as if what she had seen was an illusion or an accused nightmare. Her hand subconsciously reached up through her blonde hair to her earrings. People had a similar reaction when she used them. Did they see what she had just seen? Did these earrings contain a piece of ash and let him impose his presence through her? That thought made her feel a little better. She slapped her cheeks to wake herself up and tried to ignore the curiosity gnawing at the back of her mind. It's just world tree stuff. Ignore it. Don't ask questions. Stella had to admit her perception of Ash as a caring, easygoing tree had shifted just a tad after that experience, but she was sure it would fade. If anything, she was happy Ash now had another way to defend himself. If even she was utterly powerless against it, she doubted a star core or a narcist soul cultivator could resist such a devastating mental attack. Not even my father had such an intense glare. Stella was busy, lost in thought, when Diana's hand landed gently on her shoulder. You all right? Her hand felt clammy but comforting. Stella had to look down slightly to meet the shorter girl's gaze. Fine. Yeah. Mostly. You okay? Diana's gray eyes shifted to the tree, and her grip tightened. Better than okay. The whole sect idea got a lot more real with something I can respect as the patriarch. Sure, Ashlock was powerful before, and we had theorized he was a baby world tree. But I saw things in that gaze that I will never forget. Diana then released her grip and walked forward, keeping her eyes on the scarlet canopy above. You wanted us to head down into the root tunnel, right? A second passed, and Diana saw one of the leaves flash with lilac chi a single time. That means yes. Right. After seeing Stella nod, Diana asked the distraught girl, do you want to stay up here or come down with me? Stella gave a weak smile and shook her head, I'll stay up here. I have some books to show Ash, after all. I suspect the portal technique we bought from the merchants back in Slimere will work wonders with his affectionate gaze. Diana chuckled at the joke and looked back at Ashlock's canopy. Will it be fine if only I go? There was a long pause, but the leaf eventually flashed once. Off I go then. Diana waved without looking back. Her eyes were glued onto the root tunnel. As a sect member, this was her first mission, and she planned to please her new tree tyrant. Blue flames appeared in her palm, slightly illuminating the inside of Ashlock's root. It was hollowed out, but the sides were coated in sap that stuck to Diana's shoe as she lowered herself inside the tube. Not very spacious, I have to admit, Diana muttered as she brought her shoulders in so she could wedge herself in the tight space. Despite the steep incline, she was stuck, so she cycled her water chi and coated her skin. Then, using the pressure to push her along, she was shooting down the tunnel in no time. The air rushed past her nose as the black root walls blurred. Minutes passed, and her speed only increased as she hurtled through the inside of the mountain. She felt slight influxes of chi come and go, likely due to her passing spirit stone deposits. Just as she wondered how much longer the journey could possibly take, she crashed into a hard floor. Her chi took the brunt of the impact, and her body shrugged off the rest. Rolling her shoulders as she stepped out of a small crater, she looked around. The walls were gray stone covered in black roots with glowing mushrooms sprouting everywhere, illuminating the dreary tunnel in a soft blue glow. A mineshaft. Diana wondered aloud as she saw the tipped-over minecart and rails poking through the root-coated floor. Diana froze and hit her chi as she felt the presence of something approaching. Then, sneaking up to the wall and keeping low, she peered into the darkness beyond the mushroom glow. A cave rat. She wondered as she saw a person-sized gray-furred rodent sniffing a giant mushroom dangling from the ceiling via a black root. Even from here, Diana could smell a sweet fragrance wafting through the stale air. Before she could do anything, the rat clamped its jaw around the mushroom, and Diana watched as the black root lit up the entire cavern with lilac flames, causing the rat to explode. Showing off a lot today, aren't we? Diana grumbled as her water chi protected her new clothes from the shower of blood and guts that splattered the wall behind her. So, where do you want me to go? Diana didn't actually expect an answer. But she got one as a single root on the floor lit up with lilac flames, showing her the way down the twisting, root-covered tunnels of the mineshaft. Shrugging, she summoned a sword to her hand and followed the path while keeping her eyes and ears peeled for any threats. Luckily, it only took a few minutes for Diana to find something interesting. Is that a town? Chapter 49. An interesting monster. You are listening at novelfull.audio. With Stella off to clean up and meditate in the courtyard with a still intact runic formation, Ashlock was left to focus on Diana, exploring the caves below. His roots had grown throughout the mineshaft, especially in the direction the giant rats originated from. His deep roots, skill, combined with his higher cultivation stage, allowed for rapid growth, so in just a week, he had traversed around a mile down the mineshaft and had yet to encounter anything of interest. Just more rusted rails tipped minecarts and gray stone walls. His natural spirit sight only reached 100 meters from his roots, so if he wanted to explore more of the cave, his only option had been to overtake the entire mine with his roots. But now he had a human with legs that he could order around. So by lighting his desired path with lilac chi, Ashlock guided Diana into the depths. He honestly didn't know what lurked down here, so he had been hesitant to agree that Diana could go alone, but out of the two, she had the skills and techniques that best suited combat down here. Diana reached the edge of his roots. The path beyond was obscured by darkness for Ashlock, so he was stunned when Diana said, "Is that a town?" "A town. Down here, under thousands of meters of rock. Where these giant rats paraded around like they owned the place. How could anyone survive in such an environment? Unless the legendary dwarves truly did grace this land with their drunken laughter and magnificent beards." The image of a dwarf flying around on a sword while laughing and hurling rocks at monsters amused him. Ashlock could only see Diana standing at the edge of his perception with her sword drawn as she looked left and right, likely observing the town he wasn't privy to. In a time like this, Ashlock wished his Eye of the Tree God skill functioned underground. It used his trunk as the anchor and gave him a bird's eye view of the world from the sky. So naturally, he couldn't use it via his roots underground and had to rely on his limited spirit vision that increased in view distance as his cultivation realm improved. L.RG Ashlock, I don't know if you can see or hear me, but an abandoned town is up ahead within an enormous cavern. I can hear the sound of rushing water and the presence of those rat monsters. Blue flames then coated Diana's skin. She stepped forward and vanished from his sight. An abandoned town within a cavern, so Diana couldn't detect people other than the rats. That's a shame but also a relief. Ashlock was around 100 meters from the entrance to this cavern and, unfortunately, couldn't grow that far fast enough to be of any assistance. But a cavern should be rather big, right? Ashlock felt for his roots that covered thousands of meters throughout the mountain and located the end of a root that should be above where Diana was. Forcing through some chi, his deep roots skill went to work, allowing his root to rapidly tunnel through the rock. Something felt off. Diana strolled into the center of the mining town. As the heir to House Reborn, which acquired most of its wealth from spirit stone mining, she naturally knew the purpose of this town. The plain buildings carved into the cavern's stone walls were a rest stop, where food was sold to the hungry miners pulling extra long shifts. The distance between here and the exit to the mine was likely an hour's walk, so miners would sometimes even sleep down here if they were extra short of silver crowns. This was all normal. Even the presence of the cave rats was expected, although not in this large a number and size. What wasn't expected was their behavior. The rats all stood on their haunches in a ring around the center of the cavern, watching her walk with their beady eyes from a safe distance. Some peeked their snouts through shutterless window frames, and others camped out near the building doorways. The more daring even slowly approached Diana but never got too close. Were they scared of her? That didn't make any sense. The gray-furred cave rats were cruel and intelligent but also ferocious and famished. If they showed any signs of weakness to their brethren, they would be eaten alive by their brothers and sisters. Only the strong could survive down here. Diana scanned the room with her chi. She had tabs on every living thing in the cavern that emitted some chi. There were hundreds of rats, all keeping an ample distance. It was bizarre, eerie, and downright confusing. They had to know something she didn't. Was something commanding them and holding them back? Would this commanding monster want to save the tasty snack for themselves? A lot of questions and not many answers. Diana tensed up, and her gaze briefly snapped to the cavern's ceiling as it trembled. Something was coming, and the rats also became restless. Bits of rock rained down and smashed on the cavern's floor, which drowned out the rats' chittering. Her chi sense became distracted. Too much was going on, but one thing caught her attention: her foot was stuck. A viscous substance had latched onto her shoe and slowly crawled up her leg. Tearing her sights from the ceiling, Diana looked at the ground, which had been plain gray stone but was now shimmering slightly in the flickering of her soul fire. It moved, squirming around as if alive. Diana pulled her leg back, the strange thing lurched upwards and latched onto her knee. Panic set in as she found herself unable to escape the thing's clutches. Diana ignored the pebbles that pelted her back and shattered on impact as they knocked her head. Her soul core hummed with power as her soul fire flared to life around her entire body, but condensing around her balled fist. With a grunt, she punched down onto the thing latched to her leg with all the force she could muster. On impact, the gray slime rippled and shrunk back. A flash of relief was quickly discarded as the thing transitioned from the dull gray that had let it blend in with the floor into a dark blue. What the foo? Diana barely dodged to the side as the now blue slime crashed beside her like a wave trying to engulf her. It was huge, and more worryingly, she could feel chi coming from it. If before, it had been a null element without a whiff of chi, it was now water chi aligned. Diana cursed as she figured out why the rats had never stepped too close. They knew of this creature's existence and avoided it. Diana gripped the hilt of her blade as blue flames ignited its shiny surface. She briefly glanced at the two exits to the mineshaft. One was blocked by the blue slime slowly turning to face her like a living wave, and the other was where most of the rats were gathered. Taking on the rats would be no issue, but with the threat of the slime combined with the rats, it wouldn't be ideal. Before she could finalize a plan, the slime attacked again. It was like facing a tsunami. The slime took up half the cave in width and almost reached the ceiling. Wait! The ceiling! Diana looked up and saw what had caused the trembling earlier, a single black root with the thickness of a person coiled down like a curious snake. It was still far too high up, but it was lowering slowly. On either side of the cavern, the rodents had retreated into the buildings and blocked the doors with their bodies. Diana had no choice but to face the incoming wave of slime with her blade raised. Her sword flared with her 6th stage soul fire that was a league above this simple cave monster, even if it had absorbed her chi and become more resistant. The slime, showing a hint of intelligence, split itself into two halves to avoid her sword slash and encircled her. No matter where Diana looked, the floor was a shimmering blue, but it had dulled. Diana had never run into a monster like this, but she felt she had it figured out. A slime with the ability to absorb a person's chi and match their element. A tricky opponent to face, especially alone. If Stella was here, she could electrify it with her lightning Dao. She shook her head. It was inconvenient but not an impossible challenge. If anything, Diana felt great being able to flex her chi in a life-and-death fight that she could go all out in. Checking on the ceiling root's progress, a sly smile appeared on Diana's face. The slime had partially attuned to her water element but still had a slight darkish gray hue, especially after splitting. Come, I'll feed you. Diana taunted the glorified puddle that was closing in. She had no idea its level of intelligence, but after her words, it started rising off the ground again, forming a column of murky blue with her at the center. Intending to convert the slime to the water element, Diana activated her mist technique that had been rigorously taught since the day she could walk. A thin mist and shadows appeared as her soul fire spread into the surroundings. Diana noticed that as the mist made contact with the slime wall, it was absorbed, and that part of the slime turned a lighter shade of blue. Then, the slime began to enclose her, starting from above, clearly trying to trap her like a bird in a cage. Ashlock had switched his view to the roots surrounded by rock digging toward Diana. He pumped as much chi as he could into the skill as he burrowed deeper. It was difficult to know how much further he had to go as it all depended on how high the cavern ceiling was. Then all at once, his sight expanded to encompass the entire cavern as the root broke through the ceiling. What the hell is going on? Ashlock watched as Diana fought off a literal tsunami wave while the rats watched on from the safety of houses carved into the rock faces. They seemed to cheer on as if watching a Colosseum death match. Looking around, he confirmed the lack of dwarves. He couldn't lie, a part of him was greatly disappointed, and the town was nothing special, just holes carved into the walls with shapes for a door and window. The fight raged for a while as Ashlock tried to lower the root to get closer to the action. It was odd. He couldn't tell who could win between the two. The slime seemed to absorb chi attacks as with every water chi attack Diana launched in its direction, its presence increased and turned a lighter shade of blue. It could also split to avoid sword slashes. A rather formidable opponent indeed. Can the slime only transition into a single element, though? If so, it would be strong against a solo cultivator, but if faced with a duo where one had the water element and the other ice, I doubt the entire water chi slime could handle frost chi. It was an interesting monster, which had apparently become the apex predator around here, judging from the rat's behavior. Since this mountain cave system should be an enclosed ecosystem, if they all use a similar element, let's say earth, then the slime would naturally be unmatchable. The slime rose to the ceiling as a column, surrounding its prey like a coiling viper, slowly closing in. Diana looked upward, her gray eyes landing on Ashlock's slowly lowering root. Ashlock swore he saw a sly smile appear as she prepared to jump. A second before the top of the slime column was fully sealed, she leapt up and rocketed toward Ashlock's waiting root. "Hello, Patriarch, sorry about this," Diana said as she clutched onto the root that swung slightly from her weight. "The slime should be unable to handle your chi now that it has absorbed mine." She looked down as the slime collapsed like a raging tide onto nothing, and after seeming to notice the lack of its meal, it chaotically searched around. "Up here, you glorified puddle!" Diana shouted down to the lake-sized slime. It moved immediately, surging upwards as a swirling mass. At the last second, Diana let go and fell to the side, leaving the slime to engulf Ashlock's root. For a brief moment, he planned to surge as much chi into the slime as possible, but then another thought crossed his mind. What if he used root puppet here? It didn't explicitly require a corpse, that was just the ideal subject, as anything else would defend against the slow and painful process of being taken over by hair-thin roots. Exploding the slime with his chi would be a waste. The creature was more fascinating than harmful. Diana could escape easily if she needed to with his help. Also, once exploded, he doubted there would be much to absorb with his devour skill. And since the slime was so good at absorbing chi and actually sought it out, Ashlock was genuinely curious if he could take control of this monster and if it would last far longer than any of his previous root puppets. And if he was successful, wouldn't he be able to conquer the rest of the mine with his own strength?